Hey guys, tonight we're diving headfirst into one of the oddest, quirkiest, and honestly most delightful chapters of medieval history animals on trial. Yes, you heard that right. Imagine waking up one day in the Middle Ages, stretching your arms, and instead of just worrying about taxes or the harvest, you find yourself sitting in a courtroom watching a pig being accused of murder. You probably won't survive this trial because, spoiler alert, the pig definitely won't. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining this wild ride from around the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Picture this, the 13th century, a dusty, bustling village somewhere in medieval Europe. The townsfolk are gathered, murmuring nervously, not because of the latest tax hike or a bad harvest, but because the village pig, yes, the very one that's usually rooting around in the mud, is on trial for something shocking, not for stealing a truffle or rooting up crops, but for murder. The pig allegedly bit a child so badly that the poor kid died from the wounds, and the villagers, believing in strict justice, have brought the pig before the court to answer for its crime. Sounds crazy. Right, but in medieval Europe, this kind of thing was actually pretty common. Believe it or not, animals were sometimes treated just like humans when it came to the law. They could be accused, defended, and even punished in court. Historians still argue whether these trials were truly meant to administer justice to animals, or whether they were more about maintaining social order and conveying moral lessons to the human population. But one thing's for sure, the spectacle of animals on trial offers a fascinating window into how medieval people viewed the world and their place in it. The practice of animal trials wasn't just a bizarre medieval fad. It stemmed from a worldview deeply rooted in religious and legal traditions that saw animals as moral agents capable of sin and guilt. The church taught that all creatures were part of God's creation and subject to divine law. So, if an animal committed harm, it was only right to subject it to earthly justice. Imagine a courtroom with a judge in a tall hat, a jury of townsfolk, and in the dock, a goat or a dog or even a rooster facing charges ranging from property damage to assault. Lawyers might be appointed to defend the animal. Yes, animals had lawyers, and the proceedings followed surprisingly formal legal procedures. One of the most famous examples involves a pig in the French village of Falaise in 1386. This pig was accused of killing a child and was put on trial, complete with a public prosecutor and a defense attorney. The pig was found guilty and sentenced to death by hanging. It might sound like the punchline of a medieval joke, but it was very real. Why on earth did people do this? Part of it was practical. When an animal caused harm, especially serious harm, the community needed a way to respond. They didn't have animal control or modern insurance systems. So holding animals accountable was one way to manage conflicts and reassure the public that justice was served. Another reason was symbolic. These trials sent a message that the social order was sacred and must be upheld, if a pig could get away with biting a child. What message did that send to the community? By publicly trying and punishing the animal. Authorities reinforced the idea that rules apply to everyone, or at least to everything. Of course, this didn't stop people from adding a healthy dose of theatricality and sometimes absurdity to the proceedings. Records show animals being tried for acts we'd find laughable today, like a rooster accused of laying an egg, which, for the record, is biologically impossible, or a donkey being prosecuted for stubbornness. These cases also reveal a surprisingly human side to the medieval legal system. The animals sometimes had appointed defenders, lawyers who argued their case. Sometimes trials dragged on for months or even years, with appeals and counter-appeals, and sometimes the animals were acquitted or released, especially if it was clear the crime was accidental or unavoidable. One quirky tidbit historians love is the story of a parish in France where a group of rats was put on trial for eating the crops. The rats were summoned to court, and a lawyer was appointed to defend them. The case was eventually dismissed because, well, it's hard to argue against hungry rodents doing what comes naturally. It's a comical reminder of the limits of medieval law when it comes to nature's chaos. But not all animals got off so easily. Pigs often bore the brunt of these trials, especially since they were everywhere and could cause trouble in cramped village spaces. They were notorious for rooting through trash, eating crops, and, occasionally, biting people. So when things went wrong, they became convenient scapegoats. Interestingly, these trials weren't just a rural or peasant affair. Records show that even cities and noble courts held animal trials, sometimes for the benefit of political spectacle or to demonstrate the reach of law. What's really fascinating is how seriously medieval people took these trials. This wasn't a circus or a joke to them. They were real legal proceedings with real consequences. It might seem absurd to us, but it reflects a worldview where the line between human and animal was more blurred, and where justice was tied closely to morality, religion, and social order. Even the punishments meted out to animals were modelled on human penalties. Animals could be excommunicated, imprisoned, fined, or executed in public ceremonies. Some animals were paraded through town before their sentence was carried out, reinforcing the communal aspect of justice. One infamous case involved a sow, a female pig, that was tried and executed for killing a child in a village in Switzerland. The execution was conducted with the same solemnity as a human criminal's, complete with priests attending to the sow's soul. It might sound surreal now, but it was perfectly consistent with medieval beliefs about sin, guilt, and redemption. These animal trials also raise intriguing questions for historians. Why did this practice begin, and why did it end? How did attitudes toward animals and law evolve? Historians still argue whether the decline of these trials was due to the rise of more secular legal systems, changes in religious doctrine, or shifts in societal views about animals. One thing is clear: the trials of animals in the Middle Ages weren't just odd curiosities. They reflected a complex relationship between humans and animals, law and morality, order and chaos. So, as we continue our journey into this wild legal menagerie, get ready to meet the stars of these medieval courtrooms, from pigs and rats to monkeys and owls. Up next, we'll dig deeper into why pigs, of all animals, became the prime defendants in so many of these bizarre cases. Trust me, their stories are as entertaining as they are strange. You might think pigs are just muddy farm animals that grunt their way through life, rooting around for food and wallowing in their favourite mud baths. But in medieval Europe, pigs were the ultimate troublemakers and prime defendants in the weirdest court cases you can imagine. If you thought your neighbourhood had issues with unruly pets, just wait until you hear about the trials pigs faced. Sometimes for murder, sometimes for mischief, and occasionally just for being a pig. Pigs, as you soon discover, weren't just livestock. They were legal entities capable of being charged, tried, and convicted in courts. Their hefty size, wild temperaments, and natural curiosity made them both useful and dangerous neighbours. In tightly packed villages, where space was limited and livestock roamed freely, a pig could easily cause chaos, rooting up gardens, biting children, destroying property. These were serious offences in medieval times. One of the most famous cases took place in the French village of Falaise in 1386. The story goes like this. A pig reportedly bit a young child so badly that the child died from the injuries. The villagers, horrified and grieving, decided that justice demanded the pig be held accountable, so they hauled the pig to court, not just a slap on the snout. Mind you, they organised a full legal proceeding, complete with a prosecutor, a defence attorney, witnesses, and a judge. You can almost picture it, the courtroom, filled with grim-faced villagers. A pig in the defendant's box, probably tied up or caged. And a lawyer trying to argue on behalf of an animal that couldn't understand a word being said. The prosecution laid out their case, describing the pig's violent behaviour, while the defence might argue that the pig was acting on instinct or provoked by its surroundings. After careful consideration, the court found the pig guilty and sentenced it to death by hanging. Yes, hanging. The execution was carried out publicly as a warning to other animals and, more importantly, as reassurance to the community that justice prevailed. Historians still debate why such elaborate procedures were applied to animals. Some argue these trials served a symbolic purpose, reinforcing the idea that divine and earthly law applied universally, even to creatures incapable of moral reasoning. Others suggest these trials were practical in a time when property and bodily harm could destabilise a community. The courts used animal trials to assert control and restore order. It was also about the community's sense of justice and closure, assigning blame in an understandable way. Pigs weren't the only animals to face such trials, but their behaviour made them frequent targets. These animals were known for their unpredictable and sometimes aggressive behaviour. Pigs can bite, and when they do, those bites aren't like a playful nibble, they can cause serious injury, especially to small children. Another notable pig trial took place in the village of Saint-Pierre-de-Colle, France, in the early 14th century. Here, a pig was accused of killing a child and was summoned to court. What's fascinating is that the pig had legal representation, a human lawyer who argued on its behalf, a reminder that medieval people took these proceedings seriously, despite the inherent absurdity from a modern perspective. But it wasn't always about murder. Pigs were also brought before the courts for smaller offences, like damaging crops or entering sacred spaces. Some villages even had ordinances regulating where pigs could roam to prevent trouble. Now, you might be wondering, did pigs actually understand what was going on? Of course not, but the point wasn't the pig's comprehension. It was about the community's need to regulate behaviour and demonstrate justice. In a world where the supernatural was intertwined with daily life, animals were often seen as agents of divine will or malice. A pig biting a child wasn't just an accident. It could be interpreted as a sign of divine punishment, a warning, or even the influence of dark forces. This belief extended to other animals too, but pigs had a reputation for being particularly troublesome. Their habit of rooting and eating almost anything made them a nuisance, and their quick temper added to the perception that they were dangerous. Interestingly, the punishments meted out to pigs were often modelled on human penalties. Hanging, drowning, and even public shaming were common. In some regions, pigs were dressed in human clothes before their execution to emphasise the seriousness of their crimes and to dramatise the event for the watching community. One bizarre case from the town of Bern in Switzerland in the 15th century involved a sow that had killed a child. The sow was dressed in a robe and led to its execution by hanging, complete with a priest administering last rites. The ceremony was eerily similar to a human trial and execution, underscoring the medieval mindset that animals could be morally culpable. The intertwining of religion and law in these trials is key to understanding why they happened. The medieval legal system was heavily influenced by Christian theology, which viewed sin and guilt as universal concepts extending beyond humans. The Church's teachings suggested that animals, as part of God's creation, were subject to divine law. Therefore, if they violated human laws, they must be held accountable. This connection between religion and justice also explains the presence of clergy in some trials. Priests sometimes officiated or blessed the proceedings, further blurring the line between spiritual and legal punishment. The trials were not just about punishing the animal, but about protecting the moral fabric of society. But it wasn't all grim and severe. Some cases reveal a surprising amount of humour and absurdity, suggesting that medieval people also had a playful side when it came to these trials. The fact that animals had lawyers appointed to defend them, that some trials dragged on with appeals, and that animals could be acquitted, paints a picture of a society that took its legal system seriously but didn't shy away from a bit of theatrical flair. Take, for instance, the case of a pig in the town of Metz, France, accused of trespassing and destroying property. The pig was put on trial, but after considering the evidence, the court found that the pig was merely acting according to its nature. The pig was acquitted, and the villagers apparently celebrated the decision, perhaps relieved that justice was not only served but tempered with reason. Another quirky tidbit comes from a 15th century trial where a pig was charged with blasphemy because it had wandered into a church and disrupted a service. The idea of a pig being accused of blasphemy might sound like the setup to a medieval joke, but it was a genuine charge, reflecting the religious seriousness with which these communities treated sacred spaces. These trials also reflect the deep connection medieval people felt to the natural and supernatural worlds. Animals were not just animals. They were part of a moral universe where every action had significance and where justice had to be visibly upheld. What about the outcomes of these trials? While some animals were executed, others faced different punishments. Some were fined, or rather, their owners were. Others were confined or banished from the community. There are even records of animals being excommunicated by the church, a punishment more commonly associated with humans. This excommunication was symbolic, designed to warn the community and discourage similar sins. The question of whether these trials had any real effect on animal behaviour is a funny one to consider. Obviously, a pig can't read or learn from a trial, but the social effect was clear by publicly addressing animal crimes. Communities could prevent vigilante justice or uncontrolled retaliation. It was a form of conflict resolution, keeping peace in tightly knit and vulnerable societies. One more curious fact: pigs were sometimes arrested before the trial. They might be placed under guard or locked in enclosures, with official records noting the dates and conditions of their confinement. It's almost like medieval animal control, though without the fancy technology. Historians continue to debate why animal trials faded away by the early modern period. Some suggest that as legal systems became more secular and scientific understanding of animals and disease improved, the idea of prosecuting animals lost credibility. Others point to changing religious attitudes or the rise of new forms of animal management and control. Whatever the reasons, the legacy of these bizarre trials lives on as a quirky reminder of a time when the boundary between humans and animals was blurry, and when the law reached into places we'd never expect. So, as we leave behind the courtrooms filled with pigs, it's time to turn our attention to another set of unexpected defendants, the infamous rats of the Middle Ages. These tiny creatures weren't just a nuisance. They were the unlikely stars of their own courtroom dramas and the central figures in the blame game for one of history's deadliest pandemics. Ready to meet the real villains of medieval Europe? Then stick around. You might assume that when it came to medieval animal trials, pigs stole the show, but the real drama often belonged to the rats, those tiny, twitchy-tailed creatures that, whether you love or hate them, certainly left their mark on history. And no, I'm not just talking about their usual role as the world's greatest uninvited house guests. Rats were cast in one of the darkest roles imaginable, prime suspects in the outbreak of the Black Death, the plague that devastated medieval Europe. They were more than pests. They were villains on trial, at least in the eyes of terrified villagers and anxious officials. Imagine yourself walking through a medieval village as whispers spread about the strange illness sweeping across the land. People are dying in droves, symptoms baffling and horrifying. Everyone wants to know what or who is to blame. The answer, at least popularly, is rats. These rodents were seen not just as carriers of disease, but as criminals who needed to be brought before the law to answer for the chaos they'd unleashed. Historians still argue whether any formal legal trials for rats actually occurred on a large scale, but there's plenty of evidence that medieval people genuinely attempted to hold rats and sometimes even other vermin accountable through court-like proceedings. Records from various European regions mention rat trials, in which rats were summoned, charged, and occasionally condemned. These weren't the theatrical spectacles you might imagine with rats in the defendant box, but rather symbolic acts meant to demonstrate communal resolve against a terrifying threat. One of the strangest aspects of these trials was how seriously they were sometimes taken in the 14th century. For example, there are accounts of rats being summoned to appear in court. Town officials would issue formal proclamations demanding that rats present themselves to answer charges. Naturally, the rats never showed up, unsurprisingly, since legal summons don't work on rodents, but the symbolism was powerful. By treating the problem as a legal matter, communities sought to impose order on the chaos of the plague. What's fascinating is how this legal ritual reflected a medieval mindset that saw the world as an interconnected moral and legal order. If an animal or pest caused harm, it wasn't just bad luck, it was a violation of divine and earthly laws. Thus, taking legal action against rats was an extension of the idea that justice must be served to restore cosmic balance. The trial of rats also ties into the broader superstition and fear surrounding the plague. At a time when scientific understanding of disease transmission was non-existent, people relied on explanations that made sense within their cultural and religious frameworks. Rats, often seen as unclean and verminous, were easy scapegoats. Of course, modern science tells us the real culprits were fleas carrying the bacterium Yersinia pestis, which hitchhiked on rats. But for medieval communities, punishing rats was a way to confront an invisible enemy. One quirky tidbit: you might enjoy some medieval courts apparently appointed human lawyers to represent rats in trials. While this sounds like the plot of a medieval cartoon, it underscores how seriously these proceedings were taken. The idea was to give the rats a fair hearing, even if the outcome seemed predetermined. There's also a rich folklore tradition about rats being summoned to courts and facing verdicts, often leading to rituals like mass poisonings or community efforts to drive them out. In some cases, communities organised rat hunts, akin to legal executions, to cleanse their towns, but the effectiveness of these efforts was questionable. To say the least, rats are famously resourceful, and the plague continued to spread. sowing death and despair. The irony is that while people tried to hold rats accountable in human courts, they remained utterly beyond control. It's a reminder of how medieval legal systems, no matter how elaborate, struggle to cope with the natural world's complexities. This raises an open scholarly debate about how much agency medieval communities truly believed animals had. Did they see rats as moral actors capable of guilt? Or were the trials more about community rituals to regain a sense of control in a terrifying crisis? The answer probably lies somewhere in between, mixing genuine belief with psychological and social needs. Interestingly, the legal focus on rats had broader social implications. Blaming rats diverted suspicion away from human behaviour, religious authorities, or environmental factors that contributed to the plague's spread. It was easier to direct fear and anger at rats than to confront the limitations of medieval medicine and sanitation. Moreover, rat trials and anti-rat campaigns sometimes served as public health measures in disguise. Although people didn't understand germs, attempts to exterminate rats and isolate infected areas helped reduce disease transmission. So, behind the weird legal theatrics lay practical attempts at disease control. However clumsy. Speaking of disease control, this leads us to another curious aspect of medieval animal trials, the overlap with religious beliefs. The Church's role in sanctioning or participating in these trials illustrates the profound intertwining of faith and law during the era. For example, rats were sometimes accused of sins, excommunicated, or subjected to religious ceremonies meant to cleanse communities. This spiritual dimension further blurred the lines between justice and superstition. As we think about rats and their place in medieval courts, it's worth reflecting on how the fear and chaos of the Black Death shaped human-animal relations in deeply symbolic ways. Rats became villains in a moral drama as much as in a biological one. Their trials, whether literal or metaphorical, offered a way for terrified people to externalize and confront a seemingly unstoppable menace. But rats weren't the only unlikely defendants in medieval courts. You'll be intrigued to learn that monkeys, those curious, mischievous creatures, also found themselves caught up in legal tangles. They weren't just exotic pets, but sometimes played starring roles in medieval justice. So, as we finish exploring the rat's role in medieval trials, get ready to meet our next set of defendants, the monkeys, whose antics and trials will surprise, amuse, and perhaps even scandalise you. Imagine the shock and amusement of a medieval courtroom when the defendant is not a pig or a rat but a monkey. Yes, monkeys, those mischievous, lively creatures we usually associate with tropical jungles, temples, or your local zoo, were sometimes at the centre of medieval legal dramas. It might sound like a scene from a farce, but medieval Europe had a surprisingly complex relationship with monkeys, both as exotic pets and as supposed troublemakers subject to the law. You might picture a monkey in a tiny robe, sitting in the defendant's box, swinging its tail anxiously as the court proceedings unfold. While we don't have evidence that monkeys were exactly on trial like human defendants, there are records of cases where monkeys were involved in legal disputes or religious controversies. Often these animals symbolize deeper anxieties about the natural world, morality, and social order. Monkeys in medieval Europe were rare and exotic, mostly found in wealthy households or monasteries where they served as status symbols or companions. Their unusual behaviour and resemblance to humans made them objects of fascination and suspicion. The medieval mindset struggled to categorise monkeys. Were they closer to humans, deserving moral consideration, or were they beasts acting on base instincts? This ambiguity played into the legal and social treatment of monkeys. In some cases, monkeys were accused of destructive behaviour, stealing food, attacking people, or causing general mayhem, since they were owned by people. Disputes often arose over responsibility and damages. For example, if a monkey belonging to a nobleman mauled a servant or damaged property, the victim might seek legal redress. This led to hearings where monkeys were indirectly on trial through the arguments about ownership, liability, and compensation. One intriguing anecdote comes from 15th century France, where a monkey allegedly disrupted a church service, much like that infamous pig accused of blasphemy. This caused a scandal, and the church authorities debated whether the monkey should be exorcised, banished, or simply removed. While no formal trial took place, the event highlights the blurred lines between superstition, religion, and law. Medieval theologians grappled with questions about monkey souls and moral agency. Did these creatures possess free will? Could they sin? If so, could they be held accountable like humans? These were serious debates, reflecting broader tensions about what it meant to be human and how to fit animals into the moral universe. Historians still argue whether monkeys were ever truly put on trial in the strict legal sense, or whether their trials were more symbolic or administrative. Regardless, the stories illustrate how animals with human-like traits challenge medieval legal and religious categories. So, in a lighter vein, the mischievous nature of monkeys often led to humorous tales. Monks and noble children were sometimes tasked with caring for these playful creatures, only to end up chasing them around as they caused chaos. There are accounts of monkeys stealing lit candles, scattering church vestments, or mimicking their human keepers in embarrassing ways. Imagine the exasperated faces of clerics as their solemn rituals were interrupted by a monkey's antics. The presence of monkeys also intersected with the medieval obsession with the exotic and the marvellous. They were symbols of distant lands, representing both curiosity and the unknown. Owning a monkey could be a mark of prestige, but also a source of anxiety, as these animals did not fit neatly into existing social orders or religious frameworks. From a legal perspective, monkeys sometimes appeared in property disputes or inheritance cases, since they were considered valuable possessions. Their ownership could become contentious, especially if a monkey escaped or was lost. These disputes were often settled in courts, adding another layer to the idea of animals as subjects of law. There's a fascinating fringe tidbit that some medieval bestiaries books describing animals depicted monkeys as cunning and sometimes deceitful creatures, capable of mocking human folly. This portrayal may have influenced how people perceived monkeys' legal guilt or misbehaviour, mixing folklore with reality. Monkeys' ambiguous status also ties into medieval ideas about the great chain of being, a hierarchical structure placing God at the top, followed by angels, humans, animals, plants, and minerals. Monkeys, looking like humans but clearly animals, sat awkwardly near the border between human and beast, making their legal and moral status confusing and ripe for debate. In a more practical sense, the legal attention monkeys received highlights the complexity of medieval law itself. It wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing, but about navigating ownership, responsibility, and social order. If your monkey bites the Lord's servant, who pays the price? The owner, the monkey, or the victim? Such questions were far from trivial in a society where property and status defined much of daily life. By exploring the curious case of monkeys in medieval law, we glimpse a society trying to make sense of a world where boundaries between human and animal, natural and supernatural. Order and chaos were fluid and contested. These trials and disputes were less about the animals themselves and more about the human fears, values, and structures projected onto them. As we leave behind the antics of monkeys, we next turn to another creature wrapped in superstition and mystery, the owl. These nocturnal birds, often seen as omens of death or witches' familiars, sometimes found themselves implicated in legal and social controversies. Their eerie calls and shadowy presence made them perfect scapegoats for all sorts of medieval anxieties. So, get ready to delve into the world of owls, ghosts, and superstition. As we continue this strange and fascinating journey, owls, those silent, wide-eyed creatures of the night, have long been shrouded in mystery and superstition. But in the Middle Ages, their reputation took on a particularly spooky and sometimes legally dangerous twist. Far from being just wise symbols perched on bookshelves or university crests, owls were often seen as harbingers of doom, witches' familiars, or even agents of the devil. And in some strange medieval villages, these eerie birds found themselves dragged into the courts, accused of crimes ranging from witchcraft to causing general mayhem. Imagine a moonlit night in a sleepy medieval hamlet, the silence suddenly broken by the eerie hoot of an owl. Villagers shudder, clutching their rosaries, whispering warnings of death or dark magic. In a world where the unknown was terrifying and supernatural, explanations filled the gaps of ignorance. Owls were more than birds. They were ominous symbols that could bring real fear. This fear sometimes translated into action. People tried to capture, kill, or even prosecute owls, attempting to rid their communities of what they believed was an evil influence. Medieval legal records include accounts where owls were considered suspects in crimes related to witchcraft or misfortune. While it's unlikely that owls were tried in court like pigs or rats, their persecution was nonetheless a real social phenomenon in some places. Laws forbade the keeping or protection of owls, and communities organised night hunts to drive them away or kill them. The underlying belief was that owls were linked to witches and the dark arts, and by targeting these birds, people hoped to protect themselves from curses and malevolent forces. One particularly vivid story comes from 15th century England, where an owl was captured near a village accused of being a witch's familiar. The bird was publicly killed, and its feathers burned in a ritual meant to cleanse the village. While this wasn't a formal court case, it functioned as a kind of communal judgment, blending superstition, law, and ritual in a single dramatic act. This fear of owls was fueled by their nocturnal habits and eerie calls, which many medieval people associated with death or evil. Owls were often seen perched near churchyards or battlefields, places connected with death, further cementing their reputation as creatures of ill omen. The association was so strong that seeing an owl was sometimes taken as a direct message from the spiritual world, a warning of impending disaster. Historians still argue whether the fear of owls was primarily religious, cultural, or practical. Some suggest that, because owls hunted rodents, they were beneficial and should have been protected, but superstition overwhelmed reason. Others point out that this fear of owls reflects broader anxieties about the unknown and uncontrollable forces in medieval life. Interestingly, not all views of owls were negative. In some medieval bestiaries, owls were praised for their wisdom and vigilance, able to see in the dark both literally and metaphorically. This contradictory symbolism shows the complex ways medieval people related to the natural world, both fearing and admiring it. The owl's role in medieval culture also intersected with the church's efforts to control superstition. Clergy sometimes condemned beliefs about owls as pagan or heretical, attempting to replace them with Christian interpretations, yet popular beliefs were persistent, and the owl remained a potent symbol of mystery and fear in folk traditions. From a legal perspective, the persecution of owls illustrates how law and superstition were intertwined, while there might not have been formal owl trials. Legal codes sometimes included prohibitions against harbouring or protecting suspicious animals, reflecting the church and state's efforts to maintain social order by controlling what they saw as sources of moral or spiritual danger. The owl's symbolic weight extended into art and literature, influencing medieval stories that depicted owls as creatures that could warn of death or lead souls to the afterlife. This rich cultural tapestry made owls more than just animals. They were moral and spiritual signifiers. One curious detail is how owls appear in children's rhymes and folk songs that possibly have roots in medieval beliefs. The famous "Who Cooks For You" call of the barred owl, for example, might have been interpreted by medieval ears as a haunting question, feeding into the bird's mysterious image. As we ponder the owl's strange legal and cultural role, it's worth noting how these beliefs affected people's daily lives. Fear of owls could lead to nighttime disturbances, community hunts, and even accusations of witchcraft against humans linked to the birds. The owl became a scapegoat not just for unexplained events, but for social tensions and fears about the unseen, moving from owls to even more unusual players in medieval animal trials. We encounter one of the most delightful stories, mice with lawyers. Yes, you heard that right, mice. Those tiny squeaky creatures had their own legal representatives in some medieval courts. This episode perfectly captures the blend of humour, seriousness, and absurdity that defines animal trials of the Middle Ages. In some villages, mice were accused of destroying crops, stealing food, and causing general havoc, rather than resorting to random traps or poison, which they did. Of course, as some communities went the extra mile, summoning mice to court and appointing lawyers to argue on their behalf. These mice lawyers would present cases arguing the innocence of their clients or seeking leniency. While you might think this sounds like a medieval comedy sketch, these trials had a serious underpinning. They helped regulate communal conflicts, prevent vigilantism, and maintain social order. By ritualizing the conflict with mice, communities could collectively address their problems and affirm shared values. Historians still debate how widespread these mouse trials were, and whether they were mostly symbolic or involved actual legal procedures. Regardless, the stories endure as some of the most charming and peculiar moments in medieval legal history. So, from owls shrouded in superstition to mice with their own attorneys, the medieval courtroom was a place where the boundaries between human and animal, law and ritual, reality and symbolism were fluid and fascinatingly blurred. As we continue, we'll explore how these animal trials weren't just curious anecdotes, but also tools of social control, reflecting the power dynamics and fears of medieval society. Next, we'll dive into the deeper reasons behind these trials, uncovering how they function to maintain order and authority in a world where chaos and uncertainty were ever present. Ready to see how medieval courts used animals to send very human messages? Let's go. In the seemingly chaotic world of medieval animal trials, there lurks a method to the madness, an intricate system where animals on trial were less about the critters themselves and more about human society's desperate efforts to impose order on disorder. As strange as it seems to us today, putting animals on trial wasn't just an eccentric curiosity, it was a legal and social tool wielded to reinforce authority, settle disputes, and remind everyone of the boundaries that kept society running. Picture a medieval village court, wooden benches creaking under the weight of nervous peasants. A stern judge perched high on a platform, and before him, a pig accused of biting a child, or a rat blamed for destroying a grain store. These weren't mere spectacles for amusement. They were serious events, with real consequences for the community. The trial served multiple purposes, blending legal, moral, and social functions into a strange but effective tapestry. One fundamental reason for these trials was the enforcement of property rights and communal responsibility. In a largely agrarian economy, where survival depended on shared resources, damage caused by animals was a significant concern. Crops ruined by pigs rooting in fields or grain eaten by mice could mean the difference between famine and food security for a village. The courts provided a forum for victims to seek redress and for communities to establish rules about animal behaviour and ownership. But these trials also acted as public demonstrations of justice and control, in a time before modern policing and animal control. Holding animals legally accountable reassured villagers that authorities were taking action to protect them. The spectacle of a pig being dragged to court, tried and punished, was a dramatic assertion that law prevailed. Even in the face of nature's unpredictability, historians still argue whether these trials were primarily about justice for victims or about reinforcing social hierarchy and control. Some scholars suggest that by focusing blame on animals, courts diverted attention away from deeper social conflicts or failures in governance. Others see the trials as genuine attempts to regulate communal life in a world where boundaries between the natural and human realms were porous. Interestingly, the appointment of lawyers to defend animals highlights the formalism and seriousness of these proceedings. These lawyers, usually local advocates or clerics, were tasked with arguing the animals' cases, challenging evidence, and sometimes negotiating settlements. The legal documents from some trials are surprisingly detailed, listing charges, witnesses, and arguments with the same care as human cases. One quirky detail in some regions: if an animal was found guilty, the owner was fined or required to perform penance, suggesting that the real responsibility lay with humans. This intertwining of animal guilt and human accountability underscores the complex social dynamics behind these trials. These animal trials also intersected with medieval ideas about sin and morality. Animals were sometimes seen as extensions of human sinfulness or as instruments of divine punishment. For instance, a pig that bit a child might be interpreted not just as dangerous, but as morally culpable, embodying the community's fears about disorder and divine wrath. In some cases, trials included rituals or religious ceremonies to cleanse the community. Blending law with spiritual practice, executions of animals were often public, sometimes accompanied by prayers or church blessings, further blurring the lines between justice and ritual. This fusion of legal, religious, and social functions made animal trials a uniquely medieval phenomenon. It wasn't simply about punishing an animal, but about maintaining cosmic and communal order. By holding animals accountable, communities asserted their place in a divinely ordered universe. The psychological impact of these trials shouldn't be underestimated either. They provided a sense of closure and control in a world full of uncertainty and danger. Knowing that even animals could be held responsible and punished offered comfort to people living with threats like disease, famine, and war. Of course, not all trials ended in condemnation. Animals were sometimes acquitted, especially when their actions were deemed natural or unavoidable. Such outcomes suggest a nuanced understanding of animal behaviour and a willingness to temper justice with mercy. One particularly amusing example involves a group of rats summoned to court for damaging crops. Their appointed lawyer argued that the rats were simply following their instincts and that the villagers should take measures to protect their stores better. The court agreed, and the rats were released, probably to the delight of the courtroom audience. These legal theatrics also served educational purposes. Trials were public events where moral lessons were communicated, reinforcing norms and expectations. They reminded everyone, human and animal alike, of the rules governing society and the consequences of breaking them. From a broader perspective, these trials reflect medieval efforts to manage the boundary between nature and civilization. Animals were part of the natural world, often unpredictable and wild, but humans sought to impose order and predictability through law. This tension between control and chaos is at the heart of many medieval animal trials. The decline of animal trials by the early modern period also tells us about changing attitudes. As legal systems became more secular and scientific understanding of animals grew, the idea of prosecuting animals lost credibility. The rise of animal husbandry practices, improved sanitation, and the development of animal control mechanisms offered more practical solutions to animal-related problems. But for centuries, these trials provided a fascinating window into medieval life. They showed how law, religion, superstition, and community concerns intertwined in surprising ways. They revealed a world where animals were more than just beasts. They were part of the moral and legal fabric. So, as we leave behind this deeper understanding of why animals were put on trial, we're ready to explore some of the most bizarre and memorable cases recorded, from the famous pig executions to the mysterious trial of a goose accused of theft. These stories highlight the humour, drama, and humanity embedded in medieval justice. Up next, we'll meet some of the most unusual defendants and learn about their trials, their defenders and their fates. You'll be surprised how seriously these cases were taken and how they reveal much about the medieval mindset. Medieval animal trials were more than just peculiar legal oddities. They were the stages for some of the most bizarre, dramatic, and downright entertaining court cases ever recorded in history. The defendants, an assortment of animals, from pigs and rats to the more surprising geese, cows, and even insects. These cases reveal a fascinating window into medieval society, showing how humour, fear, law, and superstition all mingled in the shadowy halls of justice. Let's begin with pigs, those classic troublemakers of medieval courts. We've already touched on their trials for biting and even killing humans, but some cases veer into the outright absurd. Take the famous case from 1379 in the village of Saint-Marcel, France. Here, a sow was accused not only of killing a child, but also of wreaking havoc in the community by rooting up gardens, damaging fences, and frightening livestock. The prosecution presented eyewitnesses who described the sow's reckless and malicious behaviour, with one witness dramatically declaring the sow behaved like a demon sent to punish the village. The court responded in kind, sentencing the sow to death by hanging, complete with a public execution attended by the whole village. The spectacle served as a vivid reminder even animals were not above the law. But pigs weren't the only ones facing the gavel. The story of a goose on trial for theft in 15th century England is particularly delightful. The case involved a mischievous goose accused of stealing grain from a farmer's barn. Now, you might wonder how a goose could be put on trial. Did it have a lawyer? Well, in many of these trials, the animal's owner or a local advocate would speak on its behalf. The goose, naturally, was silent, but the hearing became a theatrical affair. The farmer insisted the goose had repeatedly pilfered grain, while the defence argued that the bird was simply acting on natural instincts and that the farmer's storage methods were inadequate. The court, balancing the evidence and community sentiment, ordered the goose to be confined to the farmer's yard and warned the owner to keep better watch. It's hard to say if the goose got the message, but the trial became local law, a humorous anecdote illustrating the quirks of medieval justice. Cows and bulls, often large and intimidating, also found themselves in courtrooms. In one case from 14th century Italy, a bull was accused of trampling a child. Witnesses described the bull's savage and uncontrollable nature, and the court ordered the animal to be put to death, yet the owner appealed, arguing that the bull had been provoked by a stray dog, introducing the idea that animal behaviour could be influenced by external factors. This appeal led to an extended legal debate, with the court eventually ordering the bull to be confined and the dog to be expelled from the village. The case highlights medieval courts' surprisingly nuanced approach to causality and responsibility, even when it involved animals. One of the more peculiar cases involved a swarm of locusts. Yes, actual insects accused of destroying crops in a German village. While not a formal trial in the usual sense, local authorities held a ritualized trial to drive the locusts away, involving prayers, blessings, and the burning of effigies. This blending of legal, religious, and ritual action reflected the community's attempt to impose order on natural disasters, illustrating how the line between law and superstition was often indistinct. These cases also reveal a fascinating social dynamic. Animals were proxies in disputes among humans. When an animal caused harm or damage, the courts often sought compensation from the owner. Sometimes this led to heated conflicts over liability. For example, in a 15th century French case, a dog was accused of biting a neighbour's child. The owner insisted the dog was well behaved and blamed the child for provoking it. The courts had to weigh testimonies and decide not just on the animal's behaviour, but on the social relations and responsibilities of the humans involved. These trials functioned as microcosms of medieval justice, addressing issues of fault, compensation, and community harmony. Now, you might ask, were there ever any animal defendants acquitted or found innocent? Surprisingly, yes. Some animals won their cases, often because their actions were judged as natural or unintentional. For example, a pig accused of damaging crops might be acquitted if the court found that it had strayed accidentally or that the plaintiff's fences were inadequate. These verdicts suggest that medieval courts could exercise pragmatism and mercy, balancing strict justice with practical realities. One particularly amusing verdict came from a 14th century Swiss case where a rooster was accused of waking the villagers too early and disturbing the peace, while the charges were clearly tongue-in-cheek. The court humorously declared the rooster innocent, reasoning that it was simply doing what roosters do, announce the dawn. This case reminds us that medieval justice, while often serious and formal, could also include moments of light-heartedness and even satire. The animal trials also reflect the medieval worldview, where all of creation was subject to divine law. Animals could be punished not only for physical harm, but for moral transgressions like blasphemy or trespassing on sacred ground. These trials reinforce social norms and religious values, reminding the community of their place in the cosmic order. These strange and wonderful trials were sometimes public spectacles, drawing large crowds and serving as community events. The executions of guilty animals were often theatrical, complete with prayers, processions, and even last rites. Such events reinforced communal bonds and provided a sense of justice and closure amid the hardships of medieval life. Historians still debate how seriously these trials were taken by contemporaries. Were they sincere attempts at justice, theatrical rituals, or a bit of both? The answer likely varies by place and time. But what is clear is that animal trials served multiple social, legal, and symbolic functions. As we close this chapter of curious defendants and their trials, we are reminded that medieval justice was a complex and multifaceted system, reflecting the fears, hopes, and humour of its people, from the hanging of a pig to the defence of a thieving goose. These stories reveal a world where the law reached into every corner of life, human and animal alike. Our journey doesn't end here. Up next, we'll explore how these animal trials intersected with medieval beliefs about sin, punishment, and divine justice, revealing even deeper layers of meaning in these strange legal dramas. Ready for more? Let's continue. Medieval animal trials weren't just quirky legal curiosities or amusing community spectacles. They were deeply intertwined with the era's pervasive beliefs about sin, punishment, and divine justice. To truly grasp why animals were dragged before courts and sometimes condemned, you have to understand the medieval worldview, a cosmos ordered by God, where every creature's actions were bound up in moral and spiritual significance. In this grand cosmic theatre, animals could be agents of sin or punishment, and their trials were as much about enforcing divine order as human law. Picture a medieval courtroom where a pig accused of biting a child isn't just a dangerous animal, but a symbol of disorder and moral failure. The court's decision to hang the pig isn't merely practical, it's a ritual enactment of divine justice, a public demonstration that sin will not go unpunished, no matter who or what is guilty. This blending of legal process with religious meaning was common across medieval Europe, reflecting the fusion of church and state that shaped daily life. One striking example comes from France, where a sow was put on trial for causing a child's death. Before the court passed sentence, a priest pronounced a blessing over the proceedings, invoking God's will. When the sow was executed, the event was accompanied by prayers for the victim's soul and for the community's protection. The ritual underscored that the trial was about more than punishment. It was about restoring cosmic harmony disrupted by sin and suffering. Medieval people believed that animals could be instruments of divine punishment. If a community was stricken by plague, famine, or misfortune, it was often interpreted as God's wrath against sinners. Animals behaving aggressively or causing harm were seen as part of this divine retribution. Thus, prosecuting punishing the animal, was a way to address the spiritual crisis affecting the community. At the same time, animals could also be scapegoats for human failings. In a world where understanding of disease and natural causes was limited, blaming animals was a way to externalize fears and anxieties. By holding animals legally accountable, communities symbolically confronted the chaos threatening them, reaffirming their faith in divine justice and human order. Historians still debate how literally medieval people took the idea of animal guilt. Did they truly believe animals were moral agents, capable of sin and repentance? Or were animal trials more symbolic rituals to channel communal fears and frustrations? The truth is probably complex, varying across regions and social contexts. The church played a crucial role in shaping these beliefs. Clergy often supported animal trials as part of their broader mission to enforce moral order. However, some church authorities criticised extreme superstition or cruel punishments, cautioning against attributing human sinfulness too readily to animals. This tension reflects the dynamic and sometimes contradictory religious landscape of the Middle Ages. The association between animals and sin extended into popular culture and folklore. Animals like pigs, wolves, and snakes were often linked with vice and evil in sermons, art, and literature. Conversely, some animals symbolized virtue and divine grace, such as the lamb representing Christ. This dual symbolism influenced how animals were perceived and treated legally and socially. One fascinating example is the trial of a pig accused of blasphemy in 15th century France. The pig reportedly uttered a human phrase deemed offensive during a church service. Whether this event actually happened or was exaggerated over time is unclear, but the trial captured the imagination of the public and clergy alike. The pig's fate was sealed, not just by law, but by the weight of religious outrage. Punishment of animals often mirrored human penalties, including execution by hanging, drowning, or burning. These sentences were carried out publicly, serving as moral lessons for the community. The rituals surrounding animal executions included prayers and blessings, reinforcing the spiritual significance of the act. This intertwining of law and religion also extended to the idea of animal trials as a form of penance. Owners of accused animals were sometimes required to perform acts of contrition or charity to atone for their animal's sins. This practice connected animal behaviour with human morality, emphasising communal responsibility. The legal concept of animal personhood in medieval courts is a subject of ongoing scholarly debate. While animals were not persons in the modern sense, their treatment in legal proceedings suggests a recognition of agency and responsibility, albeit filtered through a religious and symbolic lens. Interestingly, the belief in animal trials reflects a broader medieval pattern of attributing agency to non-human actors. Natural disasters, diseases, and even inanimate objects were often personified and integrated into legal and moral frameworks. This anthropomorphism helped communities navigate uncertainty and make sense of a complex world. The legacy of these beliefs persisted into early modern Europe, influencing witch hunts, superstition, and legal practices, even as scientific understanding advanced. Echoes of medieval attitudes toward animals and sin shaped cultural narratives and legal traditions. As we reflect on the deep religious and moral currents behind medieval animal trials, we begin to see how these events were not mere curiosities, but profound expressions of a society grappling with chaos, suffering, and the search for justice. They remind us that law and religion were inseparable in shaping human experience, and that animals, far from being mere beasts, played symbolic roles in humanity's moral universe. Next, we'll explore the surprising role of legal advocates in these trials, those human voices who spoke on behalf of animals, defending them with arguments and appeals. Their involvement adds another layer of complexity and humour to this already fascinating story. Ready to meet the medieval animal lawyers? Let's continue. The medieval animal lawyer. A curious figure indeed, part advocate, part eccentric, and occasionally the voice of reason amid the furor of bizarre court cases. While the idea of someone defending a pig, rat, or goose in a medieval courtroom might sound like the setup to a Monty Python sketch, it was a genuine and surprisingly formal practice. These lawyers played a key role in the spectacle and substance of animal trials, offering a fascinating glimpse into medieval legal culture, humour, and social dynamics. Imagine the courtroom atmosphere, villagers murmuring, the judge perched authoritatively, the accused animal tethered or brought before the bench in some fashion, and then a sharply dressed advocate stepping forward to defend the creature's honour and liberty. The lawyer's role was to argue that the animal was not guilty of intentional wrongdoing, or that the owner bore responsibility for the animal's behaviour. In some cases, they petitioned for mercy, citing the animal's natural instincts or the community's shared duties. These advocates were usually local clerics, trained lawyers, or community leaders with some knowledge of law and rhetoric, sometimes. The lawyer defending the animal was appointed by the court, other times. The animal's owner hired someone to represent their interests and protect their property. Regardless, these proceedings were treated with the same formalism and seriousness as human trials witnesses testified. Evidence was presented and legal arguments were made. One delightful example comes from 15th century France, where a sow was defended by a lawyer who argued that the animal had acted without malice and that the child it injured had provoked the attack. The lawyer's passionate plea included invoking the sow's natural ignorance and appealing for clemency on grounds of mercy and justice, though the sow was ultimately condemned. The legal arguments reveal a surprising level of sophistication and empathy. Medieval legal texts sometimes include model defences for animals, suggesting that lawyers prepared formal arguments for these unusual cases. These texts discuss questions such as, can animals form intent? Should they be held responsible like humans? What penalties are appropriate? These debates mirror broader medieval concerns about agency, responsibility, and the boundaries between human and animal nature. Humour played a significant role in these trials. 2. The absurdity of defending a goat accused of theft or a rat blamed for destroying crops lent a certain levity to proceedings. Lawyers often employed wit, irony, and theatricality to engage judges and audiences. The medieval legal tradition valued oratory skill, and the novelty of an animal case offered an entertaining platform for demonstrating rhetorical prowess. Sometimes, lawyers defending animals would exaggerate their clients' virtues or question the reliability of witnesses with pointed sarcasm. In one case, the defence argued that a pig's owner was negligent, allowing the animal to roam freely and thus bearing ultimate responsibility for any damage. This shifted blame cleverly away from the pig and onto human failings, highlighting social tensions between owners and neighbours. Historians still debate how sincere these defences were. Were lawyers genuinely invested in their animal clients' fates? Or was the practice a form of legal theatre that amused judges and townsfolk alike? The answer is likely a bit of both. The seriousness of legal formalities coexisted with an awareness of the spectacle and humour involved. The role of the animal lawyer also reflects medieval society's complex attitudes toward justice and responsibility. By appointing a lawyer to defend an animal, the court acknowledged the importance of fairness and due process even in the most unusual cases. This suggests a legal culture that, while steeped in superstition and ritual, also valued procedural legitimacy. In some regions, lawyers for animals were so respected that their arguments influenced verdicts and punishments. Their advocacy could mean the difference between execution and acquittal, between fine or banishment. This underscores the power of rhetoric and law in shaping medieval society's understanding of justice. The practice of animal defence also highlights how medieval law was a communal affair. Trials were public, involving not only judges and lawyers, but witnesses, neighbours, and entire villages. The presence of an animal lawyer added to the drama and communal engagement, making these events social rituals as much as legal proceedings. Moreover, animal trials served as opportunities for social commentary. Lawyers and judges sometimes used cases to critique local authorities, question social norms, or satirize human behavior. By putting animals on trial, communities could indirectly address human conflicts, rivalries, and grievances in a socially acceptable format. This tradition of animal advocacy echoes through history, influencing later legal and cultural developments. It prefigures modern debates about animal rights, legal personhood, and the ethical treatment of non-human creatures, while medieval lawyers defended animals in a symbolic and ritualized context. Their efforts remind us that questions of justice and compassion extend beyond humanity. One particularly memorable case involved a rat accused of destroying wheat in a small French village. The rat's appointed lawyer delivered a spirited defense, arguing that the rat was simply fulfilling its natural role and that the villagers should improve their grain storage instead of blaming innocent rodents. The court accepted this reasoning, leading to a decree for better community grain preservation methods. This case stands as a testament to how animal trials could lead to practical, community-wide improvements, as we marvel at the image of medieval animal lawyers passionately defending their furry or feathered clients. It's worth remembering that these trials were part of a broader legal and cultural world. They reveal the blend of seriousness, ritual, humour, and social function that defined medieval justice. Up next, we'll look at how some of these animal trials had surprisingly lasting impacts, shaping medieval society's approach to law, community, and even genetics. Stay tuned for stories where the legacy of these curious cases echoes far beyond the courtroom, influencing history in unexpected ways. The story of medieval animal trials doesn't just end with odd courtroom dramas or curious legal spectacles. Some of these cases left surprisingly enduring impacts, shaping medieval society's approach to law, community dynamics, and even our understanding of the natural world. The trials were more than isolated oddities. They became touchstones for how people thought about responsibility, social order, and the tangled relationship between humans and animals. Take, for instance, how these trials influenced the development of early legal principles about liability and ownership. In a time when property rights were still evolving and communal living complicated ownership, animal trials helped clarify who was responsible when animals caused harm. When a pig wrecked a neighbour's crops or a dog bit a passerby, the courts had to decide if the owner was negligent or if the animal acted beyond control. These decisions contributed to the nascent legal doctrines of fault and compensation, laying groundwork for modern concepts of liability. A fascinating example is a 14th century French case where a boar escaped its enclosure and destroyed a neighbour's vineyard. The court held the owner accountable because he failed to secure the fence properly, ordering compensation. This ruling is a glimpse into the evolving understanding that property owners must take precautions to prevent their animals from harming others, a principle that echoes in today's laws on pet ownership and liability. Beyond legal theory, animal trials shaped community relations. They served as venues where neighbours could air grievances, settle disputes and reinforce social norms. In societies where formal legal institutions were limited, these public trials acted as important mechanisms for maintaining harmony and mutual respect. By dealing openly with animal-related damage, communities reinforced the idea that everyone had a role in upholding order and that even animals had boundaries not to be crossed. This social function is evident in cases where entire villages participated in trials or collective punishments. For example, when a rat infestation devastated grain stores in a German village, Authorities organised communal rituals, combining legal proclamations and religious ceremonies to drive away the pests. These events reinforced communal solidarity and shared responsibility, intertwining legal, social and spiritual dimensions. Interestingly, these animal trials also intersected with medieval beliefs about heredity and genetics, albeit in their own unique way. While medieval people obviously didn't have modern genetic knowledge, they recognised patterns in animal behaviour and traits, associating lineage and breeding with characteristics and abilities. Some trials addressed questions of animal nature versus nurture, debating whether an animal's harmful behaviour was inherent or caused by mistreatment or environment. One curious case from Italy involved a dog accused of repeated attacks on villagers. The defence argued that the dog's aggressive nature was due to poor breeding, suggesting that owners should be responsible for ensuring good lineage to prevent such incidents. Though rudimentary, this reflects early ideas about inherited traits influencing behaviour, a concept that centuries later would evolve into the science of genetics. Moreover, the legacy of animal trials reached into the symbolism and art of medieval Europe. Animals involved in trials often appeared in illuminated manuscripts, church carvings, and folk tales, embodying moral lessons about justice, sin, and community. These images helped communicate complex ideas to largely illiterate populations, embedding the stories of trials into cultural memory. One particularly evocative motif is the Dance of Death, where skeletons lead people and animals alike to their graves. This artistic theme, popular in post-plague Europe, resonates with the era's preoccupation with mortality. Justice and divine order themes echoed in the animal trials. The trials thus contributed not only to legal and social history, but to the rich cultural landscape of the Middle Ages. Historians still debate the extent to which animal trials influenced broader legal developments. Some argue that their direct impact was limited, and that these trials were more ritualistic than substantive. Others see them as a reflection of evolving legal consciousness, where the boundaries of personhood, responsibility, and justice were tested and expanded. Regardless, these trials remain invaluable windows into medieval mindsets. The persistence of animal trials into the early modern period shows how resilient these practices were, even as Europe underwent dramatic social, religious, and scientific transformations. They remind us that legal culture doesn't change overnight, but is shaped by tradition, necessity, and community values. As we look at the legacies of animal trials, it's also intriguing to consider their echoes in modern times. Today, debates about animal rights, legal personhood for animals, and ethical treatment can be traced back to these medieval curiosities. The idea that animals might be more than property or wild creatures, that they might have interests deserving legal protection, is part of a long historical conversation. In a sense, medieval animal trials were early chapters in humanity's ongoing negotiation with the natural world attempts to understand, control, and coexist with the creatures sharing our environment. Their strange but earnest efforts laid foundations that continue to influence law, ethics, and society. So, as we prepare to conclude our journey through the weird and wonderful world of medieval animal trials, it's worth reflecting on what these stories tell us about human nature. They reveal a society grappling with fear and order, justice and mercy, reason and superstition. They remind us that the boundary between the human and animal worlds has always been a site of negotiation, conflict, and yes, humour. Next up, we'll wind down with a gentle reflection on how these medieval stories connect us across centuries, offering comfort, perspective, and a reminder of our shared resilience, ready to drift into a softer, more contemplative space. Let's finish this adventure together. As the night deepens and you find yourself sinking ever deeper into this strange and wonderful journey, it's time to reflect on the curious world of medieval animal trials, not just as odd historical footnotes, but as windows into humanity's enduring relationship with justice, society, and the natural world. These cases of pigs dragged to court, rats blamed for crop failures, and geese accused of petty theft might seem like the punchline to a joke, but behind the humour lies something deeply human, a quest for order in chaos, fairness amid fear, and meaning in a capricious world. Imagine the village square, a gathering of people from all walks of life, farmers, merchants, clergy, and children crowding around the courtroom. The scent of wood smoke and damp earth fills the air, punctuated by murmurs of gossip and nervous laughter. Here, the community confronts its troubles together, be it a rampaging pig or a swarm of locusts. The trials are as much social performances as legal proceedings, with everyone playing a role in affirming the values that hold their world together. In medieval society, where life was precarious and death often sudden, the animal trials served as rituals of control and reassurance. When misfortune struck, crops destroyed, children injured, food stores ruined, these events helped villagers channel their fears into a structured response. Holding an animal responsible was a way of externalizing chaos, projecting blame onto a visible, tangible culprit, rather than the unknowable forces of nature or fate. This impulse to seek justice even against non-human defendants reveals the medieval blending of law, religion, and community. The trials were infused with spiritual significance. Punishing a pig for killing a child wasn't simply about the act itself, but about restoring divine and social order upset by sin or neglect. The prayers, blessings, and rituals accompanying executions emphasized that justice was a cosmic affair, not merely a local matter. Yet these proceedings were not devoid of humour or humanity. The image of a lawyer earnestly pleading on behalf of a rat or a goose, weaving arguments about natural instincts and owner negligence, speaks to a medieval appreciation for fairness and empathy. It shows a society wrestling with complex questions. How do we balance mercy with justice? What responsibilities do humans bear for their animals? Can creatures outside the human realm be held to human laws? The public nature of these trials also meant they were moments of communal catharsis. The entire village participated, sharing in the drama, the lessons, and sometimes the absurdity. The spectacle of an animal's trial and execution could unify a community, creating a shared story to remind everyone of boundaries and consequences. It was a form of social glue, binding individuals through collective experience. Moreover, the medieval animal trials invite us to reconsider our modern relationship with justice and responsibility. Today, we wrestle with similar issues on vastly different scales, debates over animal rights, environmental stewardship, and ethical treatment echo the medieval struggle to find our place in a world shared with other beings. The notion that animals might deserve legal protection, that their interests might be considered, is a modern evolution of the ancient impulse witnessed in those courts. Medieval beliefs that animals were moral agents or extensions of human sinfulness might sound quaint, but they reflect a deeply interconnected worldview. People saw themselves as part of a cosmic order, with humans, animals, and the divine all linked. When that order was disturbed, whether by disease, disaster, or animal misbehaviour. Restoring balance was a collective responsibility. Historians still debate the sincerity and impact of animal trials. Were they earnest judicial acts or theatrical rituals? Did they truly influence broader legal traditions? The likely answer is that these trials served multiple overlapping functions: legal, social, religious, and psychological, each vital to medieval communities navigating a perilous world. As you imagine the scene, the pig's trial, the rat's defence, the goose's mischievous antics, you also glimpse the resilience. Those medieval people, despite the hardships of their time, they sought fairness, order, and meaning. They used humour and ritual to face fear, and in doing so, forged bonds that sustained their communities. These stories, strange and humorous as they are, connect us across centuries. They remind us that history isn't just dates and facts, but lived experiences rich with complexity, contradiction, and humanity. They invite us to see the past not as distant or alien, but as a mirror reflecting our own struggles with justice, responsibility, and coexistence. So as you nestle deeper into your blankets, ready to drift off, carry with you this thought that the medieval animal trials, with their blend of earnestness and absurdity, offer a comforting reminder, no matter how chaotic or frightening the world seems. Humans have always found ways to seek justice, create order, and connect with each other and the creatures around them. Next, we'll gently slow the pace with a soft, soothing reflection to close this story, leaving you with a calm and peaceful mind as sleep embraces you. Let's move toward that gentle end, as the night grows quieter and your thoughts begin to drift. It's time to gently close our journey through the captivating and occasionally baffling world of medieval animal trials. These tales, rich with humour, drama, and humanity, offer more than mere entertainment. They connect us to a long chain of human experience, stretching back centuries, revealing how people have continually sought meaning and justice in an unpredictable world. Picture the flickering candlelight in a medieval home as villagers share stories of the pig that stood trial, or the rat that was defended by a sharp-witted lawyer. These narratives, passed down through generations, became more than historical curiosities. They were lessons wrapped in laughter and solemnity, reminders that life is complex, often messy, but always intertwined with a shared quest for fairness and understanding. The medieval trials teach us about resilience, not only the resilience of individuals, but of entire communities confronting adversity, whether dealing with plague, crop failures, or the mischief of animals. People created rituals and legal frameworks that helped them process fear and loss. The trials served as a collective response, transforming chaos into order, uncertainty into a narrative that could be managed and remembered. One of the most striking legacies of these trials is their role in shaping the evolving relationship between humans and animals. Long before the modern animal rights movement, medieval communities recognized that animals were part of the social and moral order. While they were often seen as property or instruments of labor, animals also carried symbolic weight, reflecting the health and harmony of the community. The involvement of lawyers defending animals highlights an early form of advocacy and justice that transcends species. These figures remind us that justice is not static, but adapts to the needs and beliefs of society. The presence of humour, theatricality, and even mercy in these trials reveals a legal culture willing to engage with complexity and ambiguity. Historians continue to explore how these curious cases fit into broader medieval legal and social systems. Some see them as windows into popular belief, others as evidence of legal innovation. Whatever the interpretation, animal trials remain a fascinating chapter in the story of law's development and society's efforts to navigate a world shared with other living beings. As you settle deeper into your own world, think of the medieval villagers facing their challenges with a mixture of seriousness and wit, law and ritual, fear and hope. Their stories remind us that history is alive, filled with the same contradictions and capacities that define our own lives. And so, as your breathing slows and your eyelids grow heavy, let the image of those medieval trials fade gently into the quiet night. Picture the last candle flickering out, the courtroom emptied, and the village returning to peaceful slumber, ready to face whatever the dawn may bring. Remember, the echoes of those pig trials, the geese's misadventures, and the rat's spirited defence live on not only in dusty archives but in our ongoing dialogue about justice, community, and our place in the natural world. They are part of the rich tapestry of human experience that continues to unfold with each new day. Now, as you drift off to sleep, carry with you a sense of connection to the past, to the present, and to the future. Let the stories of medieval animal trials lull you into dreams where the absurd and the profound dance together in the soft glow of candlelight and the gentle hum of night. Sleep well, knowing that the journey of human resilience and humour continues, weaving through time like a comforting thread, uniting us all in the great story of life as the gentle darkness enfolds you. Take a moment to breathe deeply, letting the day's worries slip away like leaves floating down a quiet stream. The medieval world, with its curious trials and colourful characters, now feels distant yet strangely familiar. You have travelled through time and charm and law, through pigs on trial and geese accused of theft, discovering how humour and hope intertwined in lives long past. Imagine the flicker of a candle, its light soft and steady, casting warm shadows on ancient stone walls. Hear the murmur of voices, the laughter mingling with solemn prayers, the rhythm of a community bound by shared stories and rituals. In that moment, the past and present meet, connected by the timeless human desire to find order amid chaos, justice amid uncertainty. Let these reflections settle like a gentle lullaby, soothing your mind and heart. Know that, like those medieval villagers, you carry within you a resilient spirit, one that can face the unknown with courage, humour and grace. The strange trials and tales remind us all that even in the oddest moments, there is meaning, connection, and the promise of a new day. So close your eyes, feel the softness of your bed, and let sleep take you gently into dreams where history's whispers mingle with your own hopes and stories. Rest easy, dear listener, and wake refreshed, ready to continue the remarkable journey of life.